Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host in Berkeley, California today, and as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Ohio.
And we have a special treat today. We have a return guest, Dr. Rodrigo Acuña, who works as an independent journalist and analyst on Latin America. He actually publishes a newsletter every 2 or 3 months called Newsletter on Latin America, so you should check that out. And then Rodrigo has also made a documentary called Venezuela, The Cost of Challenging an Empire with journalist Nic Ford. We're going to be talking about that a little bit today.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Thanks for being back with us. Yeah, we definitely want to talk about the documentary. But to begin, Venezuela has seemed to be heightened in the last month or so. The U.S. has been conducting these aggressive actions for quite some time, long before Trump even. But it really seems to have escalated more recently under the guise of interdicting drugs and so forth. You want to just discuss that and why you think that it's escalated at this particular point, what these attacks mean, how do you think Venezuela is preparing for it? Just a general view of what you think is going on right now.
I think that Trump has returned to a long established aim of his, which was to remove Nicolás Maduro from power in Venezuela. The difference now, perhaps, is that he has surrounded himself with yes men in the White House and the upper echelons of the Pentagon that are willing to go through with some of the madness which he has been proposing or asking his advisors to the proposals that they've put forward. And he's now trying to pursue those. So just to give you some background, obviously the United States, since Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela in early 1999, it became quite clear that it was not going to be business as usual in Caracas. What they were faced with was a government who attempted to renegotiate and did renegotiate many of the contracts with the oil companies and engaged in many policies which were quite social democratic. At first, Chavez called for an end to the civil war in Colombia. He denied US access to Venezuelan airspace in the Colombian government's fight with the FARC rebels. He denounced US foreign policy towards Cuba. And after those policies became evident, Washington decided to back a coup d'etat against Hugo Chavez in 2002. And that really radicalized the process. That turned Chavez and the Venezuelan leadership from a sort of a social democratic European left to a more hard Latin American left, and decided to make strategic alliances with Cuba, looking to build regional organizations. So since then, the United States started imposing economic sanctions and started to look for almost any means that were available to them to try and remove first Hugo Chavez, and then when he passes away in 2013, his predecessor, Nicolás Maduro. Now, the reason why they haven't been successful is that after the coup d'etat in 2002, Chavez essentially got rid of all the people that participate, the upper echelons of the military that participated in the coup. And he introduced, my understanding is, many other positions in terms of the Venezuelan military, generals and admirals. So the structure is now much more complex and not as easy as, say, in Chile in 1973, where you gather 6 or 7 or 8, 10 generals in a room, and if the majority agree, then there's a coup d'etat. So the structure is different of the Venezuelan military. And they also started to travel a lot to Cuba and engage in courses in Latin American history, strategy, etc., etc. So now you have a very different military which backs the political project in Venezuela. And to bring the story forward to the Trump era, Trump asked several of his advisors and the Secretary of Defense, what are the options? What can we actually do to get rid of Maduro? And none of the options appeared to be genuinely backed by the US State Department. The options such as trying to assassinate the president or send a small invading force, I mean, they may have looked good on paper, but in terms of the practicality of carrying out these plans, none of them have worked. And while sanctions certainly had a huge impact on the Venezuelan economy and things being critical round about the years of, say, 2016, 17, or all the way up until about 2019, what has happened since that year, 2019, 2020, is that the Venezuelan economy has actually started to recover and started to grow. And that is because I think the reason for that is that there has been almost an agreement or an understanding between Chavismo and the Venezuelan business community, in the sense that for a very long time they tried to get rid of Chavismo by force, but they were unsuccessful. So they were either going to try and work with the government in some manner, or further expropriations would take place, and that was not going to be in their interest. So when I was in Venezuela last year, one of the things that I noticed in these supermarkets was, one, they were well stocked, but more importantly, the number of products on the shelves that said made in Venezuela was quite impressive. And these products were not simply products that are made in state enterprises. Many of them are made by members of the local business community. So the fact that the economy has started to recover, I think, would have sent warning bells to people inside the Trump administration that they don't want a successful Venezuela. They couldn't care less whether it's democratic or not democratic. What they don't want is a model that can become an example or challenge them regionally, and especially given the case that you now have Lula back in power in Brazil, and you have a center-left and a very vocal government in Bogota in Colombia. So it's time once again to try and put the squeeze on Venezuela. And this idea of classifying Maduro as a narco-terrorist, this goes back to Noriega in Panama in the 1980s. This is nothing new, despite the fact that all credible international experts, or most credible international experts on the drug trade, would say that Venezuela plays a minimal role in the exporting of cocaine or any other narcotics. It's more of a transit point, small transit point. But certainly this is a label that the Trump administration feels they can place on Maduro and try and sell it internationally.
Well, the countries that are more allied with Trump are the bigger exporters of drugs, like Ecuador. Even the ruling family in Ecuador is more tied to the drug trade than anyone in Venezuela.
Correct. And I think even now the Malay administration in Argentina, I think the high-ranking ministers has been involved, or a family member. There's some connection there. And certainly, yes, if you look at who the biggest players are in the drug trade historically in the region, it's always been members of the far right that are connected to the paramilitary organizations. When you have had center-left governments in power, not all of them, but I would say a noticeable amount of them have actually had greater success in trying to reduce the amount of narcotics that are exported to the United States. And that's done through a combination of law enforcement, but also policies in order to promote campesinos to grow other crops and not grow coca, providing them with suitable alternatives.
You want to talk just a bit more about the politics of oil? In the U.S., even when it comes to the Middle East, they don't talk about that much. But when it comes to Venezuela, it's really never brought up. It's a major oil producer. How does that figure into this?
Oh, that's something that Trump has been certainly aware of. This is a man who's said famously, "Drill, baby, drill," and he's mentioned that to his advisors. I've been recently reading Mark T. Esper's biography when he was in the White House, and he actually said to Trump on many occasions, openly talked about, we need to get the oil, we need to get Venezuela's oil. So I think because he comes from that business background and his outlook on the world, he would be thinking, why we or have we in the past? He made comments about US involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. Why not look closer to home and look at Venezuela? And Venezuela not only has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia apparently, but it also has gold, and there are also other resources there which make it a country where you would certainly want to have your companies doing business there and doing business in a manner which is going to benefit the shareholders of those companies. Don't worry about the Venezuelans. But the problem is that you have a country which a significant, noticeable percentage of the population has backed the Bolivarian Revolution for all its faults, problems, and contradictions, and there are many. They see themselves as being part of a project where they get to have a say in how the resources of their country are used and distributed. And you see that. That's one of the things that, and we can talk about this later, the documentary I made with journalist Nic Ford. But that's one of the things that for a long time has really upset me, is that if you actually travel to the country, you almost have to be blind or committed to projecting another image of the country in terms of the amount of construction which has been taking place. You could see very large apartment complexes being built all over the country in a project aimed at providing public housing to a substantial amount of the population. The amount of hospitals, the amount of schools. There's certainly a lot of corruption that has taken place. But the Bolivarian Revolution, again, for all its faults, problems, and contradictions and complications, it actually has delivered. That is something that the people in Latin America have been observing. And that's one of the reasons why the regional political right and the old school imperialist in Washington, they don't want that project to be successful, because then it becomes the famous threat of a good example.
One thing I'm curious about is that American oil companies are working in Venezuela. I believe that Chevron got a license to pump oil, which it started doing over the summer. And then we started seeing, at least in the media, I think the escalation was happening a long time before that. But we start seeing this escalation. How is that affecting Chevron's relationship with the government? Trump administration's doing.
Yeah, look, I think this is something that again, there's a lot of nuance involved, and that's that there has been pressure from sectors of the business community to try and do business with Maduro, because Maduro, at least economically, has been much more open to doing business with just about anyone in order to kickstart the economy. So if you're going to make a distinction between president, when Chavez was in power and Maduro was in power, Chavez was certainly much more of an old school radical in the sense of talking about cooperatives and, yes, trying to use international capital to benefit his political project, but trying to place the driving engine much more on the hands of trade unions and peasant cooperatives, etc., etc. And Maduro, in that regard, is much more of a pragmatist. Maduro, and this is why he's received a lot of criticism from inside the political left in Venezuela and abroad as well. Maduro, I think, a part of it is certainly still committed to the original project, but he understands that the economy has to be, you can't project yourself regionally if your house is not in order, if you don't have an economy where the supermarkets are well stocked. And yes, that has come at a cost domestically and in some regards, but it has also produced results. And as I said, the results are in the fact that the economy has been growing, and the fact that one of the historical problems of Venezuela, in that it would import a substantial amount of products into the country. Now those products are actually being produced domestically. So you rewind to a few years ago, I think it was 2010. I mean, they had a problem where there was a toilet paper shortage, and people would ask, how can you have an economy with so much oil dollars coming into the country, but don't have enough toilet paper? And that's because they never actually built a toilet paper, factories to be able to supply the domestic market. So those simple issues that had not been resolved because Venezuela simply just imported everything because they could afford it. That's something that has begun to change under Maduro, and I think there are some noticeable results.
That's that's a really important story. In the US media, all we get are these hysterical stories about how horrible it is and how everybody's angry and pissed off. What accounts do you think for this increase in domestic production and this increased economic activity? Is there kind of more foreign investment, China, Russia, India, countries like that, or or is it just oil revenues are increasing?
Chinese investment, Russian investment, Iranian investment, and even American investment. So the message has been, we're open for business and you can do business here because we now have a domestic business community that is happy to do business, to work inside the country. And it's also because an important section of the domestic opposition started to realize that they're not going to just be able to get rid of Chavismo using the old school Latin American tactic of just getting the military, or just rubbishing the government through the media, and then there's enough political pressure that the government resigns. So that has meant that many of them have participated in local elections, and but unfortunately, the hard right has still continued to be happy to accept financing from the United States and continue with that line of, we need to remove Maduro, we need to remove Maduro, we need to remove Maduro. But if they had actually unified, and I mentioned this in the documentary, during the 2021 regional elections, they could have actually defeated Chavismo and held the balance of power inside the country. But they have refused to. The sectors of the opposition, which are internationally viewed as the most vocal, are the ones precisely are still happy to take US dollars and call for the violent overthrow of the government, even though the chances of them domestically succeeding, gathering enough members of the military to do that, minimal. But they make a lot of money from that.
Would that be somebody like Guaido?
Exactly, exactly.
And
Wait.
does he have any credibility inside Venezuela?
No, no. Now these characters are able to get some support originally, or use the original support because they win some the governorship in some region, and then they try and build on that. But they try and build on it to the point where, again, they are not able to appeal outside of their original political base. The only one that I can think of in terms of having an international profile was Capriles Rodonsky, who immediately after Chavez died, when the presidential elections were held in 2000, and I think Chavez died in 2013, so that would have been in 2014. He actually made some concessions and said, we may have disagreed with Chavez on so many points, but we have to concede that he brought the issue of poverty onto the political agenda. That's something that we have to recognize. And if I win the presidency, I'm not going to expel all the Cuban doctors. I'm going to keep many of the government's programs in place. Now, apparently there were leaked internal memos that suggested that should he have won the elections, that was actually going to be the opposite. But the fact that he publicly conceded that means that he was thinking on another level. But the majority of these historical leaders are simply incapable of doing that.
One thing that has been a big topic of conversation in the US in the last month or so has been around political violence. And it's in the film, and then we see a lot of political violence. We've seen a lot of political violence in Venezuela around the election, for example. I saw a news article today when I was researching for talking to you today that there was a false flag operation that the Venezuelan security forces disrupted, that the far right was going to try and blow up the US embassy or something like that. I'm curious about the impact of political violence during the election or in other times on the sort of operation of the country. Like, how much has it disrupted things?
Political violence has had a huge impact every time the ultra-right inside the country try and trigger a crisis. They are predominantly responsible for the violence in the country. And that's not to say that Maduro's human rights record is impeccable. It's certainly not. But when you look at the major crisis, when you look at the number of campesinos who have been killed in the countryside, the overwhelming majority falls on the political right, the extreme political right. And it serves them not so much domestically, but internationally, to have the country's security forces going to protest and firing tear gas. That looks terrible for the government. But many of these demonstrations in the past, what will happen is they will be held in a particular part of Caracas, a wealthy area of the city, and they will hold a rally there. I'm talking about the political right here, extreme political right. And they will give a few speeches and people show up, and it's almost like a barbecue style atmosphere. But once all of that is done, then they bring in youths that are often paid from the slums, and they will arrive with weapons, with Molotov cocktails, with homemade weapons, and then decide to engage the security forces. And then all hell breaks loose. And then the cameras come out and then they're filmed, and it's Venezuelan opposition is being violently repressed. It's actually not the Venezuelan hardcore right-wing opposition which is engaging in those demonstrations. A lot of the times, those are actually paid youths that are carrying out that violence, and it's precisely to put the government in a position where they have to break up these youths and the actions that they're carrying out and making them look bad. And then these youths, again, they call them the guarimbas. And it's a term it's a Venezuelan slang term, but it essentially means violent political demonstrations with the aim of causing disruption. For example, they'll put barbed wires between posts. A lot of people in Caracas drive motorbikes, for example. And in 2017, I think the two largest guarimbas were in 2014 and then in 2017. Numerous motorcycle drivers were beheaded because they would run into these pieces of very thin wire that were laid out specifically to harm them. And the list goes on and on. And that, again, that's not to say that the Chavistas are not responsible for any political violence. There have been cases. But when you look at the actual numbers, you do a sort of a breakdown, at least the ones that can be clearly identified as political violence. It's overwhelmingly historically coming from the political right, from the hard political.
We're going to talk about the documentary, but I want to talk about the most recent incidents. Trump is now blown up, what, three? I'm not even sure. I know it's a couple,
I
maybe
think we're up to
three.
five. I think
Five,
we're up to
okay.
four or five. Yes.
We've got a few things going on in the U.S., so the media hasn't been talking about it much. What's the Venezuelan response been to that? Has the country rallied? I saw a short piece the other day. Maduro already has civil defense groups. They remind me of the kind of community groups in Cuba, and I guess they've been mobilized. What's the response in Venezuela, and how are they now preparing for increased hostilities or increased aggression or subversion or however Trump decides to do it?
I think there's on the streets. My understanding from the people that I've talked to, there's a combination of anger, there's a combination of fear, there's a combination of uncertainty. But it's certainly true that the number of people that have shown up for recruitment to be recruited into the national militia has been huge. So they certainly have been preparing, and we're seeing this now, the images come out of the country, but they've been preparing for a very long time for a potential confrontation with the United States. So the idea is to have almost as many people armed and prepared for a full-scale US invasion. And obviously, militarily, they're not going to be able to defeat the United States in a conventional war. But the idea has always been quite similar to the Cuban form of thinking, is just to bloody the nose enough that US military commanders decide or think about things multiple times before they decide to actually carry out an invasion. They're looking at developments really closely. So I spoke to someone recently, and hopefully I'm going to include his comments in an article I'm going to write. But he was telling me that they're looking at all of the strengths of this flotilla off the coast of Venezuela, and they're looking at all the weaknesses, and they're doing the same thing internally. So what are our weaknesses and what are our strengths? And he was saying that he thinks that there is a possibility that Trump could overplay his hand in thinking the support that the political system still has and how keen people are in terms of putting up resistance and having an understanding that if the Maduro administration was overthrown and removed, in order for the government's programs to be removed, you'd really have to have a really harsh military dictatorship implemented. You'd have to have a lot of Chavistas killed. And that's something that the hard right opposition in the country understands. And that's something that, while they understand, it's easier said than actually done. You need to be able to find the generals that are prepared to do that, and then you need to be able to find the foot soldiers that are prepared to do that. So when Guaido was the darling in the United States and he was declared the real president of Venezuela, when he was given money to try and get members of the military to defect and try and get Colombian paramilitaries to go back to the country and carry out a coup, I think it was there was an article. I'm just trying to think of the publication, but basically there was an investigative report done into what he was actually doing with the money, and basically he was whoring it up in Panama with his advisors. And very little of this money actually made it back to actually training members of the Venezuelan military that were prepared to defect, and actually training Colombian paramilitaries to prepare for an invasion. And when they finally did get something up and running, this is the Silver Corp USA paramilitary organization, they were actually defeated by local fishermen. They were quickly captured. They actually landed in an area of the country which is heavily pro-Chavista. It was ridiculous. So again, the idea of overthrowing Maduro, even with all the superior firepower, air power, navy power that the United States has, it's easier said than done when you have a population which has some level of weapons available to them. But also, more importantly, they are motivated and they are prepared to fight.
That's when they were trying to do their own little version of the Bay of Pigs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was even more of a debacle than the Bay of
Secretary of State is Marco Rubio. I think he's also National Security Advisor right now, who's a diehard right-wing Cuban. And some parallels I've seen is that it is where the U.S. is trying to bring the sort of strategy and logic of what they're doing in Gaza to Latin America, to the Caribbean. No accountability, impunity, an expansive notion of national defense. And so it's not just a framework in which they're used in Latin America, but it seems like it's just a U.S.-Israeli, probably other ally like framework of this, where what we say goes, and we'll wipe you out otherwise.
Can Venezuela,
No, sorry, go on. Yes.
can Venezuela expect any assistance, not necessarily militarily, diplomatically, politically, economically, from countries like China, Russia, Iran, or even the kind of pink countries like Colombia or Mexico or Brazil? Here in the US, the only person of note speaking out against this has actually been the Republican Rand Paul, whereas the beloved Bernie Sanders called Maduro a dead communist dictator.
So
Zoran
Zoran Mamdani did today too.
He called he
Maduro a
attacked
dictator.
Oh, really? Yeah. But do you think there would be like international support for Venezuela if Trump continued this?
I do. I think there will be strong diplomatic support from Russia, from China, from Iran, from Brazil, from Colombia, from Cuba, from Nicaragua, from even countries which are diplomatically hostile to Venezuela, like Chile. But I think more importantly is how long will the Venezuelans be able to, more importantly is what will this attack look like? Will they just fire a few cruise missiles, destroy 2 or 3 air bases and military installations? Or is this going to be the type of strike aimed at decapitating the government's leadership? What will be the magnitude of this if there is an attack? What will be the magnitude of the attack? Because from the perspective of the warmongers in Washington, I would suspect that they would still continue to try and divide the Venezuelan military and get them to carry out a coup d'etat. So that's something that a lot of people you would be observing, and that's what's going to be the real problem. Diplomatically, Venezuela will receive support, even at the height of the Trump administration claiming that Guaido was the legitimate president of Venezuela. Internationally, there were only about 50 countries that supported the United States in that position. The rest of the world still continued to recognize Maduro as the president. And even here in Australia, where historically the Australia is a close ally of the United States, the Australian government did not expel the local ambassador. And publicly they would say, yes, we don't recognize the government, but yet the ambassador still continued to function in this country. I think, yes, diplomatically, Venezuela will receive a lot of support, but the problem will be is the magnitude of if a military strike is going to occur. That's the real worry.
I guess I think we're gonna switch over to the film with some questions about the film. My first question is, just to get it started, is why did you and your co-creator Nicholas Ford decide to make a movie about Venezuela?
So the idea came about from the fact that, I mean, I've been traveling to Venezuela for many years now. I actually did my honors thesis on the Chavez government's programs in health and education. And then after that, I eventually did a PhD on Venezuelan foreign policy. So because of that, I've traveled many times to the country. And as I said before, the anger, it troubles me, it bothers me that the reality that I see on the ground and all the things that I've read, the materials that I've read, there's just a huge contrast to how the country is portrayed in the mainstream media. So that was the idea behind trying to put so many of the stories on film, on camera, to actually interview the victims of the political violence in Venezuela, to actually show what these government housing projects look like, to actually just walk around the place and just do some filming and not just go to the wealthy suburbs and interview members of the opposition, which is something that so much of the mainstream media will do. They will arrive in the country, one, sending journalists that don't speak Spanish. Number two, will almost immediately book themselves a hotel in the eastern part of the Caracas, the wealthy part of Caracas, and then go and interview these extreme right-wing politicians who most of them even speak English. So the conversations are taking place in English. And then that's it. That's their report on Venezuela from the New York Times. There was a journalist who was there a couple of years ago, and then people started to troll him because of the reporting that he was putting out. There was another one from The Guardian who famously didn't even speak a word of Spanish, and he became the Guardian's foreign correspondent for Latin America. He even published a book on Venezuela eventually, but he didn't speak a word of Spanish. And the same thing, it was almost like 70% of his reporting, or the people that he would quote, were members of the extreme right-wing opposition. And then he put in a sprinkle of government official quotes, often taking them out of context and saying, okay, this is what's happening in Venezuela. Again, whether you agree or disagree with the political project, I think it's fair to say that for a very long time now, anywhere between 45, 50, 55% of the country, voters in the country have continued to support the political project. And those people are simply not going to go away or have not gone away until now. They're still present.
Where can people find the documentary, or is it available for viewing?
So we launched the documentary independently late last year, and anyone that wants to organize a screening can certainly get in contact with us publicly. But we do aim to eventually, I think by the end of this year or early next year, place it on a platform where people can actually just pay a small fee and then upload it. So that is our objective. We are first-time filmmakers, so we're navigating through this whole process of putting together a film and then presenting it to the public.
I guess that would be my question. All right, this is the first time you've made a film, a documentary. And so what was some of the, not to steal from the title, but what were some of the challenges, or what was difficult about that, being it was your first time? Was your co-creator, it was also his first documentary?
Yes, Nick, it was Nick's first documentary as well. The challenges were massive. We essentially funded the majority of this project ourselves. And then when we we're confident that we were going to be able to complete the project, we made an appeal on GoFundMe and received a couple of $1,000s from people that liked the teaser that we put together. But the challenges were massive. Filming in Caracas, for example, is almost a nightmare. Logistically, it's a complicated city. It's a type of city where you may plan to interview someone at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then the metro stops and you can't get to that person. Or there's a massive political rally and half the city is paralyzed. The challenges were huge. And then you've got, so not only the problem of actually going to the country and then doing the filming, you've then got to upload all of this material onto your laptops. You then need to take care of the local crew. You need to feed them. And then you've got to come back to Australia and sit through hours and hours and hours of footage and try and edit it and make it into something coherent. Even though you may have had an original script, a plan, that is an absolutely grueling process. And I can tell you that in the end, it took us something like 2 years and 8 months to put the film, to complete the project.
And some of the stories that you tell in the film are quite heart-wrenching. It's like some of the victims of political violence. One of the reasons I asked you a question earlier about political violence was to draw some of this out. Robert Serra, I believe you talked to his mother. He was murdered by the right-wingers.
That's right. Robert Serra is a story that I think many more people should know. He was a brilliant young Chavista politician. He was a member of Congress, and he was often seen as a potential sort of successor to the leadership, or one of the leadership positions in the country. And he was betrayed by his own bodyguards, and he was stabbed, I think something like 20 plus or 30 plus times in the neck, and suffered was brutally murdered. And this was a member of Congress. This was a politician. If any of the members of the political right had been executed in such a manner, I'm fairly certain that most people that follow the country politically would know his name. But Robert Serra, he was originally just a guy from the lower side of town who won a scholarship, I think he studied law, and then rose up the ranks of Chavismo because of his charisma, because of his capacity to debate members of the opposition and say, these are the reasons why I support this project and I'm defending it, and you're a hypocrite because of this and this reasons. His nickname was the machine gun because he used to speak so fast. But he was certainly quite a brilliant politician. And then, as the mother claims in the documentary, she believes that there is a link between the people that murdered her son and former president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, who we know has certainly supported the opposition, the hard right opposition inside the country. So that's one of the stories that we covered. And the other story that we covered was of a young man who was simply going home. And during these demonstrations, the guarimbas, he was, because of the color of his skin, was labeled a Chavista.
Mm.
And then this crowd of youths that had been paid for by members of the hard right turned on him, decided to beat him up and stab him. And then eventually they poured gasoline on him and they set him on fire. And it was an absolutely brutal murder, but just one of many
Right.
murders that have taken place. And again, almost completely ignored by the mainstream media.
If that had been someone from the far, it probably would have been on the headlines of the Washington Post or the New York Times, about how brutal, violent leftists are, which is what has happened here in the last month or so.
Oh, exactly. Again, if it had been Marina Corina Machado, if it had been Guaido, or even someone lower down the ranks, everyone would know their name. This would clearly prove the brutality of Chavismo, when what you've actually had on the government's end is people being arrested for attempting to or participate in a coup d'etat. You've had some media licenses taken away. You've had certain occasions where the Chavistas, their rallies will clash with members of the opposition and scuffles break out and someone gets a busted nose. Again, it's not to say that they're perfect, but when you look at organized violence, when you look at serious violence, it's almost always organized on the part of the hard inside the country.
Yeah. They're similar, very similar to here.
Exactly.
One other question I had about the film is that it sounds like you talked to a lot of people in Caracas. Did you go outside of Caracas into like countryside, rural areas?
So we did. We went to precisely the fishing village where these US mercenaries arrived with the Venezuelans and the Colombians and the son of a former general. And it's about a 3 hour drive from Caracas, but then to actually get there, because there are no roads, you can only get there by boat. So we went on a speedboat for, I think, maybe 20 or so minutes, and we went to this remote fishing community. And that was not easy because when we arrived, people were looking at us, well, who are you? What are you doing here? You're obviously not local. Are you connected to the government? Who are you with? And we spoke to the local police sergeant and just explained who we were, what we were doing there. And he sized us up and said, okay, maybe I'll talk to you, maybe we'll see. But then as we talked to other members of the community, they realized that we were there to do what we were saying we were there to do. We wanted to talk about an incident that had occurred, these paramilitaries that had arrived a few years ago. What did you guys do? How did you react? And once we did that, then we eventually managed to win the trust of this local police sergeant. And he also wasn't happy or doesn't have a good relationship with the media because he was one of the members of the police that participated in capturing these mercenaries. So his image was then broadcast nationally, and then he started receiving a lot of death threats. So he wasn't happy to talk to the
Right.
media, but as I said, eventually he did sit down and give us an interview.
I had one other question, which is just hearing about the sort of process of making this film. You and Nick, or you have any other similar projects in the works?
So Nick is off
Film
now.
projects.
Yeah, certainly. Nick is now in Africa. He's actually trying to complete a documentary on the IMF and the World Bank and how they have tried to ram these structural adjustment packages onto African countries. And we've also done some filming for a documentary we'd like to do on Australia's participation in the coup d'etat in Chile in 1973. So, for your listeners who may not be aware, a few years ago, the Australian government confirmed, and this was thanks to the research done by Professor Clinton Fernandez, the Australian government confirmed that they had actually sent ASIO and ACIS intelligence agents to operatives to Chile to collaborate with the CIA in the 1970s in the overthrow of the leftist government of Salvador Allende. So that is an important story, in my opinion, because Australia, prior to the coup d'etat in 1973, did not actually have a Chilean community. And after the coup, many Chileans arrived. In fact,
Mm.
at one point, we were, if not the largest Latin American community, we were the second largest. And the initial wave of people that arrived were obviously people that were politically persecuted. But then, even in the 1980s, the people that arrived afterwards, or during the 1980s, these were economic refugees. These were people that were finding it really hard to live, make ends meet inside Pinochet's Chile in the 1980s. So they applied for visas and they ended up arriving in Australia. Essentially, in summary, there would not be a Chilean community in this country were it not for the coup d'etat in 1973. There were certainly a few Chileans living in the country before that, but not to the point where you would say there is a community in the country.
And
Well,
for folks who want to dig into
oh,
the Green and Red archives, we have a great interview with Clinton about that research,
and
his legal
Rodrigo.
battles, and then also one with Clinton and
They were
Rodrigo.
both on the one for Chile.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, but we also did one with Clinton first.
Yeah.
But on the 50th anniversary of the Chilean coup, we talked with Clinton and Rodrigo. So,
Yeah, we'll put that in the notes. The last thing I wanted to ask is obviously you can expect Trump to continue these actions based on, I assume you're talking to people, clearly you're reading the Venezuelan press. Do they seem prepared for this? Are they ready for more, not just attacks at sea, which as horrific as they are, somewhat limited, but drone attacks or attacks on infrastructure? Does there seem to be an idea of preparedness there?
Oh, I think they are. They understand that the conventional resistance that they can put to to the United States military is going to be limited, but then it's actually controlling the country, controlling the capital, and that's where that sort of street by street combat will be necessary. And as I said, they are analyzing the situation. This gentleman that I was talking to, he was telling me that there's even one of the US Navy ships was meant to be decommissioned this year, and it's actually currently off the coast of Venezuela. So they were even speculating that it was even cheaper for the US military to actually just blow this ship up than to actually decommission it properly. So they suspected that if there was going to be an incident, it might be around this ship might actually be sunk. And then you've got a sort of a Gulf of Tonkin situation after it's sunk, then obviously the people that are going to be blamed are the Venezuelans. But as I said, I think that the United States might misread the situation. This is not Panama. This is not a country where the US already has military bases inside the country. Manuel Noriega there's nothing positive really that can be said about Manuel Noriega. Manuel Noriega inherited a political movement from Torrijos, who was a progressive nationalist general in Panama. But then it's suspected that even Noriega had something to do with Torrijos' murder. So he then takes up the banner of the Panama Canal, but he did not have a substantial amount of support inside Panama. So that's why it was also so easy to overthrow him. I think that, as I said before, the Bolivarian Revolution still has strong grassroots support, as much as some people may be highly critical of Maduro. I think they understand that if the government is violently overthrown, what's going to happen to their project is over. And a lot of the government's supporters and grassroots organizers are going to be killed. I think they clearly understand that. And the other thing is that Venezuela, and this is, I think, something that's not known outside of the country, is that Venezuela spearheaded the independence movements in Latin America against the Spanish Empire in the early part of the 1800s. So they have that history to draw from. And that's why they had a level of credibility when they were trying to set up these regional institutions with Brazil, UNASUR, ALBA, Petrocaribe, because they were seen as they can draw from this history. So I think many of them are prepared for a very long, hard battle. The question is, how long will they be able to resist, and how fierce will, if a US military attack takes place, how fierce will this attack be, and how successful?
Right. I think we'll leave it there. Folks, we've been talking with Dr. Rodrigo Acuña, who is a Latin American journalist, or a journalist covering Latin America, analyst. He lives in Australia. And we've been talking about politics around Venezuela, as well as his new documentary, Venezuela, The Cost of Challenging Empire. Rodrigo, it's always good and great to talk with you. So really appreciate you joining us today. Folks, if you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Rodrigo, hopefully we can talk to you again soon. And everybody else out there, make trouble and misbehave.
Thank you.